voluminous introduction. I will, excuse me. I'm going to be talking today about a specific area of parallelism between music and language, namely the area of rhythm, but that will become clear as I go on. So I need to set some general background just as a kind of warning. This is mostly for the linguists in the room. Some of it, you just have to take my word for it. I'm going to assume some basic concepts of phonology like syllables and phonemes. This is not an experimental talk. There will be no measurements of anything. I don't follow the traditional generative model of language in that I don't think that there are autonomous linguistic modules. And in fact, this is going to be an argument against an autonomous linguistic module, specifically the rhythm module of language as opposed to the rhythm module of everything else human beings do. I'm going to argue that they are one and the same. Another prejudice that I inherit from both natural phonology, which was my original training, and cognitive grammar, which is my current paradigm, is that evidence for linguistic structure is everywhere. So evidence for linguistic structure is not just sentences or pronunciations of words, but it's also how people recite nursery rhymes or sing songs or chant while they're marching, and we'll see examples of all of those as we go along. So, phonology, for those of you who are not familiar with the term in general, is the linguist's study of the structure of the sounds of language. That is, the kinds of consonants and vowels that you make when you speak, how you group those sounds into syllables and larger units, feet and phonological words and so on. Excuse me. And it's also the study of the kinds of sounds there are in human language. So what the possible variations of sounds are, also the vocal apparatus used to make sounds, also the perceptual mechanisms used to listen to and categorize sounds, and group them, process them. So for me and those who work in a similar paradigm, which I express most extensively in my textbook, Cognitive Phonology, phonology is the real-time implementation of stored, idealized, embodied representations, or the perception of those representations is implemented by others. So what that means is, we have in our heads some representation of idealized speech sounds for some word like dog. And phonology is what mediates between what's stored in our heads and what comes out of our mouths. Or, alternatively, it's the mediation of the sound waves that hit our ears going into our heads and landing on the lexical representation, the word we have stored as dog. So it's a two-way street of either perception of speech or production of speech. So that also means that when other people are speaking, we hear their speech as if they are saying, as what they're saying is what we would have said if we had said it. So when we hear, when I hear a woman with a fundamental frequency in her voice of 150 hertz saying dog, I hear that as the word dog. I filter out and pay no attention to the fact that it's a higher pitch because I take into account the fact that it's a female or a child with a 250 hertz fundamental frequency. When I hear a foreign language that I don't know, I hear a foreign sound, I hear it as some distortion of my sound, of one of the sounds of my language. And that's what we call having a foreign accent, because when you hear it as your own language, you then produce it as your own language. And then there are long stories I could tell about the child language acquisition, and also simply the fact that almost any sound that we experience in the world, particularly animal noises, because this is something we tend to imitate a lot, we store in some sense as phonemic representations in our own language. And so that's why, for example, if you buy a bird recognition book and it tries to tell you what a woodpecker sounds like or a robin sounds like, it's always written in English words. If you bought a French bird recognition book, it would be written in French words. And of course, birds speak neither English nor French, so it's simply whatever you can do that its output sounds most like the bird. And then when we hear it, of course, we hear it as if the bird were speaking English, if we speak English. So that's part of the kind of cognitive assumptions that I'm making when I talking about phonology. So, one of the areas that is the most controversial, the most discussed, the least understood, the least agreed upon areas of linguistic structure is what we call stress, or sometimes it's called accent if you're not a technical phonologist. And phonologists generally distinguish between stress and accent, but I'm not going to go there right now. It seems to be the least autonomously, purely linguistic thing we have, because it seems to interface with everything else or so many other things that we do. So for example, they're taking a videotape of this. If you watch the videotape and line it up with the audio trace of my speech, you'll see that, now that I'm talking about it, of course I'm going to mess it up, but if you look at my hands just doing these expansive gestures, you'll find that they tend to reach their maximum point of distance from my body on the accented syllable. Because in fact, we align our vocal gestures with accents, not just in English, but in other languages that have an accent system. This is work done by David McNeil and others. And of course, we chant for many different reasons. I'll talk about a few reasons why we chant a little bit later. We sing, we dance, and we do communal physical work, pulling on a rope, chopping, whatever, the various cultures coordinate their physical work using speech, using the accented syllables of their language, assuming the language has accented syllables, and that's something I won't spend much time talking about today. We know a lot about accent or stress in general, but we don't understand as much as we'd like to. In most, but not all languages, at least one syllable in a word has a stress or an accent, that is a strong beat. Not all languages do that, though. In some languages, French is a good example, it's not a word that has an accent, but an utterance, a breath group. The last syllable of the breath group receives the accent, unless it's a schwa, in which case it's the second last, but you don't need to worry about the details. And as I said, in many, many languages, those accents coincide with physical gestures when people are speaking, head movements, eyebrow movements, and so on. There's also a tendency across languages for, if you have an accent for every word, there's a tendency for the time between the accents to be approximately even. Approximately. It doesn't work perfectly. And in fact, there are hundreds of articles on why that's wrong, and then hundreds of articles on why, no, you didn't measure it right, it is right. It is the case that you don't get exactly even time measured in milliseconds between beats. But if you actually do the same thing with a symphony orchestra doing Bach or Mozart or someone else whose beat is supposed to be even, you'll find that the beats aren't quite as even as the theory or the metronome would say, or because the conductor is making the beats and they're not, nonetheless we tend to perceive them as isochronous. So, talking a little bit more about stress in languages. In some languages, quite a few actually, the same syllable, the stress in a word is always in the same place. And in those languages, sometimes the stress pays attention to the kind of syllable to put the stress, and in other cases it doesn't. And in some languages, the stress in a word is not predictable. You have to learn each word individually. So those of you who are non-native speakers of English know when you learn English, you have to memorize which syllable is accented in each word. So there are nice minimal pairs in English. These words don't look like they're pronounced the same, but they are actually pronounced the same, except for the stress. So we have billow and below. Same vowel, same consonants, but accents. I chose this pair because unlike the usual pairs you see in linguistics textbooks, this is not a noun-verb pair. These are just completely randomly unrelated, but nonetheless they have the same segments, they just happen to have different stress patterns. Okay, then there are languages which have what's called quantity sensitivity, which is to say the stress always lands on a particular kind of syllable, usually traditionally called a heavy syllable. Oh, sorry, let me back up. Sorry, I jumped ahead. Quantity insensitive. There are languages where you simply put stress someplace in the word. It's called edge sensitive. So, for example, in French, as I mentioned, you put stress on the last syllable of a string of segments. And in, in Finnish, you put stress on the first syllable. In quantity-sensitive languages, you put stress on what are called heavy syllables, that is, syllables that have a consonant, a vowel, and at least one more consonant, or a consonant and a long vowel if it's a language that has long and short vowels. And then sometimes in those languages, you put the stress on the heavy syllable, but not the last one of the word. It could be the second last, or sometimes even the third last. Let's see that. Oh well. There's a slightly later version of this where I have a couple of examples of Arabic, Latin, French, and Hungarian, so I guess we'll just have to skip those. Okay, so, but let me back up here. But notice the way I've been phrasing this is to say you put stress on the heavy syllable, or you put stress on the first syllable. And in a metaphor that I got from my mentor and colleague David Stamp, suggested that it's actually putting it backwards. It's not that you put stress on the heavy syllable or the first syllable, but rather that you put the first syllable or the heavy syllable on the stress. He says it's kind of like saying Thursday comes on Christmas this year. We don't say that. We say Christmas comes on Thursday because Thursday is the regularly repeating pattern, which is what rhythm is, and then you put the stressed syllable of the word on the rhythm. And that's pretty much what I'm going to be arguing for the rest of today. I'm going to argue that the ability to do this is something we do all the time, not just in saying the words of our language following the stress pattern of our language. So I'm suggesting that there's an inherent rhythm that human beings have when we align speech and many other things to that rhythm. I'm going to get technical here for a minute. This is a little bit like the concept of construal in cognitive grammar. That is, you have some image that you want to convey or some message that you want to convey, and depending on your purpose for conveying that image, you can convey it, say, a sentence with a transitive verb in it. You can convey it with the subject, with the doer of the action as the subject, or you can look at it from a different angle, a different construal, and portray it with the patient, the receiver of the action, as the subject. So alternative ways of looking at syntax. Okay, so let me back up a little bit and say that just like speech, music is generally associated with regular beats. Now, I should back up and say not all music has regular beats. There are kinds of music like, say, Javanese gamelan music that don't have identifiable beats. They have some other things going on instead. But a lot of music in human cultures is associated with this particular beat. And whenever that's the case, those beats are always associated with physical gestures, whether we're talking about the conductor conducting or somebody tapping their toe while they're listening along. And of course, if you're playing a musical instrument, the gesture is the beat. Because your gesture on the violin, or your gesture of the expression of air when you're playing a trumpet or a clarinet, that your body's movement makes the beat in the first place. Now, of course, just as with speech, not every note you make, not every syllable of a word you sing is an accented syllable. Only some of them are. And just as with language, music notes are grouped together to form measures, or smaller or larger units, where there's a beat note and then some additional beats that are associated with it. I'm being very general here because I don't want to limit it to just European 3/4 and 4/4 and 2/4 music, but leave open the possibility of different kinds of numbering. So there's a few, in the last 10 years or so, a number of psychologists have started looking at the psychology of music production, and trying to understand music production and perception, and trying to understand how it relates to the rest of our bodily activity. And there's a researcher named London and a number of others who suggests that human beings, and actually some other animals as well, and I believe parrots can do this, African greys anyway, is the ability to align two different kinds of things at the same time. This is called entrainment. So human beings, and apparently parrots and a few other animals, when they hear a regular beat, can align their body in some way with that beat, either by tapping or stamping or jumping up and down or dancing. So essentially, entrainment is just in-phase alignment of a number of recurrent patterns. And the patterns, of course, don't have to be exactly 100% aligned. They can be aligned in whole number multiples. So instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, you can go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can have different numbers of patterns aligning as long as there's one place in both of the patterns where they line up. That's the beat. And so this kind of alignment can be people clapping together. So like you hear sometimes, especially in European concerts, at the end of a particularly spectacular concert when people applaud, and it's chaotic at first, but eventually resolves into a general rhythmic clapping where everybody is in training with everybody else in the room. Particularly when you do that when you want an encore. It doesn't happen so much in North America, but
more so than it used to.
More than it used to, yeah. Or when Gordon Lightfoot is singing and strumming with his guitar, he is aligning his speech with the hand movement of his hand. This again is another kind of entrainment. So, when we hear music, we perceive it as speech. And we can recast music into speech. Even instrumental music, and some of you may be old enough to remember a very popular group in the 1960s, who it turns out are still going. A group named the Swingle Singers, who took classical music. This particular example is from Mozart. This is Eine kleine Nachtmusik, I believe. And what they did was to replace the musical instrument parts with voice, singing nonsense syllables. So you may recognize the music here. I attempted to do a phonetic transcription of it. It's not great. It's a little bit hard, but get the general idea. Because this is the standard musical notation with a number of parts. I think there may be more parts in the Swingle Singers version of it. But wait a minute, sorry, wrong button here. Going in the other direction, jazz singers, at least in the Western jazz tradition, sometimes replace a musical instrument with their voice. Sometimes they do it when they're just improvising a melody, and other times they do it when they've had a melody that they've been playing with some instrument, then they stop and they sing. So this is Chet Baker, and this is just raw syllables. It's called scat in the jazz tradition, although there are other traditions that do this too. So I think this is going to, I had pulled this off of YouTube, so it may or may not be terribly good. We'll see. So he's making himself into an instrument, and he's using speech. English speech, of course. Well, I guess is at least a possible English syllable. So, oh no, I'm wrong. I do have the examples. I just put them in a different place. Okay, we're good. So, the model I'm building here is that in our heads we have language, which is a string of segments, phonemes, roughly, sort of, kind of, roughly equivalent to letters, not so much for English as for some other languages, but we store that. And as we implement them, we map that string into a pre-existing rhythm, following the principles of English stress, which tells us for most words, that syllable's got to land on the stress, that syllable's got to land on the stress. It's more complicated than that because English has secondary stress that is more predictable. Count to before and put the stress there, and some other rules like that. Other languages, here's some examples of languages with quantity sensitivity. So this is Latin. In Latin, the rule is you put the stress on the second last syllable if it's heavy, that is either long or closed. Otherwise, you put it on the third last syllable. So this is the word for farmer, agricola. Modern Standard Arabic stresses exactly the same rule. So you put the stress on the second last syllable if it's heavy. So if this is the word I wrote, katabtu, apologize for the pronunciation, goes on the second last syllable because it's heavy. But if the word were kitaba, meaning he wrote, then it would go on the third last because the second last is a lighter, short syllable. In French, as I mentioned, the stress always goes on the last thing you say, assuming it's not a schwa, so French, palatalisation. In Hungarian, stress always goes on the first syllable. So this is the word thank you, köszönöm. Stress goes on the first syllable. So you line the syllable up. With the first beat in what you're saying. And if you have several words, then you go da 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 da, or da 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 da. Sorry, da da. Always on the first of the string, no matter how long the string is. Okay. We can align this string of segments in normal speech in a kind of default way. But we can also rearrange things so that if we have to talk really quickly, we're able to do that and sometimes throw things together. And if we speak very slowly, we arrange the segments and sometimes change the pronunciation of the segments to align with a much more even accent pattern. Another piece of this is if you look around the world at languages, at kinds of music, musical instruments generally align their accents with the beginning of a piece of sound, not the end. So, I mean, this is obvious with something like a drum, where you align it with when the drumstick hits the drum, not when the sound dies away. And the same is true, of course, for a musical instrument, where you play a note, and the note lines up with the onset of the note on a clarinet or a trumpet or a violin as the sharp edge. And if you look around the world at for the phonology of languages around the world, you'll see that the syllable structure of languages looks like it was built to work the same way. Because the most common syllable type in the world is a consonant followed by a vowel. And in fact, there are some languages, like, say, Hawaiian or other Polynesian languages, where that's the only syllable you get. Other languages have more complicated syllables with something after the V of the CV, but all languages have CV syllables. And then some languages have CVC, and some other languages have more complicated ones, but this is kind of a universal. And so a number of researchers who look at the perception of music and language, like Usha Goswami, for example, have argued that this kind of sharp onset, slow decay structure is why syllables in languages generally follow this general CV and then maybe another consonant, or CV and maybe like a liquid or a nasal, like you get, say, in Spanish, almost simplifying a little bit. Okay. So, in addition to just the natural rhythm of the language, sometimes we have our speech line up with some external constraint. So for example, in marching, this is an old US Army march, maybe not that old I guess, but where you want people to keep their marching together, so you get them to entrain their marching with their chanting. So here's Mama, mama, can't you see what the army's done to me? I used to drive a Cadillac, now I carry one on my back. Notice, by the way, each one of those 4 lines has the same number of beats. It really doesn't matter how many syllables there are. You just move them, squeeze them, and stretch them until they fit exactly right. Different kind of rhythm for a different purpose, not walking, but pulling something heavy. Of course, our most, at least English-speaking tradition, sea shanties, which are also a genre of music. But here's one that some of you may have learned in summer camp. I know I did. Which is, heave her up and away we'll go, heave away, Santillana. Heave her up and away we'll go, all on the plains. You get the general idea. And that was their original purpose. Now, of course, they're an art form. And you can go to folk clubs and hear them. But they originally were really for pulling the ropes that raised the sails or raised the anchor or whatever it was that you were, whatever task you were trying to do, that involved a much slower rhythm, getting not only entrainment of you with the rope, but everybody else holding on to the rope. And you entrain vocally because that's a very useful cue. Everybody can hear it without having to look. So you can pull and hear at the same time. So what I'm suggesting is that this setting a string of words, a string of phonemes essentially, to an external rhythm is something we do all the time, and not just for work purposes like the sea shanty or the marching. We do it for fun. So we can set new words to an old melody. I'll give you an example of that in a few minutes. We can do it without any planning. So at least in English-speaking world, there is a taunting chant, da 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 da, which you can set any words at all to. So I can just, although it's usually, you know, Johnny has a hole in his pants or something, you could also say, it's gonna rain today. It doesn't matter what the segments are. You can line them up with the beats in the appropriate way. Same's true for political chants. Hey, hey, ho, ho, somebody or other has got to go. And the somebody or other can be a 1-syllable name or a 20-syllable name. It doesn't matter. You line it up so that it fits the rhythm. And we do this effortlessly without even having to think about it. Parodies. Some of you may be old enough to remember Pogo, a political cartoon from the 50s and 60s. Every Christmas, the author would have everybody sing a Christmas carol, but with different words. Some of you may remember this. Deck us all with Boston Charlie, Walla Walla Wash and Kalamazoo, Norris wheels freezing on the trolley, Swaller Dollar Cauliflower Alligaroo. You can do that. If you know the melody, you can do that. And it takes no effort whatsoever.
It was the same words every year.
Yes, it was, that's true. It was the same words every year. And he did more than one. That's the only one I ever remember. I suppose you could look them up because I know there are books on his work. Christian hymns, as printed in hymnals, usually have 4 or 5 lines of music, and they have 5-10 verses. And the verses don't line up with each other. That is, each verse doesn't have the same number of syllables. It just has the same number of beats. So we got here just Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. And then, for the born of Mary, and gathered all above. Pardon, my voice is a little off today. But you get the idea. The number of syllables doesn't matter as long as the number of accents in a line is 4 in this particular case, because pretty much almost all traditional Christian hymns are 4 lines and 4 beats per line. And again, it doesn't matter the syllables. So this is somewhat more looser than the poetry you learned about in school with, you know, iambic tetrameter or something like this. It's just 4 beats. It's all tetrameter, it doesn't matter. Okay. And you can do this even if you've never seen the words before. So we all know this melody. comes out. You can all do this. And then shout, under time on the phone, and Dad, please leave me alone. It would have been better if I transposed this, but unfortunately, the only MIDI version I could find was a little high. Anyway, you get the general idea. So, let me change cultures here entirely and talk about approximately 2,000-year-old tradition, which is the traditional Ashkenazic chanting of the Torah, done every Saturday morning and several other times a week. The Torah, of course, the 5 books of Moses, is traditionally chanted a few pages at a time in a set pattern. In approximately the 6th to 10th century of our era, a group of people called them, I never know how to pronounce this word, Masoretes, anyway, those guys. They developed a standard method. Presumably they codified an existing standard method of chanting the Torah. And although it's now 1,500 years later, the general principles have not changed. We don't know for sure whether the melodies have changed because they didn't have tape recorders in 700 AD CE, but we know most of it has remained the same. So every major word, each lexical words, every noun, adjective, verb, some of the longer adverbs, and the prepositions that are more than just one syllable long, that for technical reasons we won't go into. Every word in Hebrew has an accent. The accent is almost completely predictable, but not completely. When the Masoretes started working on this, the Hebrew Bible was written only with consonants. That's a slight simplification, but it'll do. They wrote some vowels, but not all of them. And of course, the text is sacred because it's the Torah. So if you're going to help people read it, you can't change the text because it's sacred. So what they did was to develop a way of helping you read the text without changing the letters, because the letters only represented the consonants, simplifying a little bit. So what they did was to develop a series of dots and dashes and stuff to represent the vowels. And they put them kind of around. So this is the word, the first word in Genesis, in the beginning, Bereshit, that's modern Hebrew pronunciation. That's just B, R, Sh, that's a Y, which is acting as a vowel. I said there are a couple of exceptions, and that's a T. It's actually a Th, but we won't go there right now. So what they did was to put dots in. So they put these 2 dots here to represent a schwa. They put a dot in here to represent the fact that this symbol could either represent a V or a B. It was supposed to be a B, so they put a dot in it. They haven't changed the letter, just marked it. And then this 2 dots under here is A, the single dot under here is E, and the Y is kind of also there. So that's actually slightly redundant. But they also marked the accent. But unlike modern English, where we mark accent with an acute accent, they had 27 different ones because they were marking something besides the accent. They were marking the melody that you were supposed to sing that word on. It's more complicated than that because not only did they mark the stress and the melody, but there's a number of different melodies depending on whether the word is at the beginning of a sentence or in the middle of a sentence or is part of a compound phrase or it's at the end of a sentence. It's much more complicated, but this will do. So here is a Hebrew with the accents marked. So in addition to this is a schwa, this is an A, this is an E, this thing is an accent. So it tells you that this is the accented syllable, and it also tells you which melody to sing.